Tilea's Troubles, Part 11. The Duchess Departs. A Battle Report. Summer 2401, Ebino, Northern Tilea. The preparations were made, and the Duchess declared she was as ready as she could be for the dangers ahead. Thankfully, she was an experienced rider, for if not so, then her disguise would have been an ineffective ruse. Cloaked in green and carrying a spear, she was armoured in mail and wore an iron helm just like the other horsemen in the little company she had joined. It had been suggested she instead rode with the knights, clothed in full-plate armour, upon a barded warhorse, the better to protect her from enemy blows. This was an idea the knights themselves had keenly supported, for then they would have the honour of personally defending their lady. But she had refused, knowing she would be discomforted by the disguise, unstable in the saddle, and unable to ride anything like as fast as needed for a successful escape. Once the knights realised that by not accompanying her, they would instead have the ominous honour of sacrificing themselves in combat to fend off the foe, rather than simply pelting from the city as fast as their mounts could carry them, they readily, if somewhat sombrely, accepted the idea that the Duchess would ride with the light horsemen. If the Duchess had heeded the advice of her council and left already, then this desperate ploy would not have been necessary. But she could not be moved, in any sense of the word. Most stubbornly, she had insisted she would stay with her people as long as possible, and only when it was certain that Ebino could not hope to survive alone would she leave in an attempt to fetch help. Now was indeed that time, for the enemy was closing on Ebino in strength. The city's walls were strong, moated and in good repair. Against any other foe, such defences would prove a considerable challenge, and a bloody one too. Against the already dead, however, they could only delay the inevitable. As long as the vampire commanders could reanimate their fallen, the shambling masses of their fly-ridden rank and file would press on remorselessly. They would not even need to collect faggots and billets to fill the moat, as a living army might attempt, but could simply pour in piles of walking corpses until a stretch of moat was filled. Then, after the rest had crossed, the sodden corpses they had trodden over could claw their own way up the banks to reinforce them. And even if an assault was not attempted, but rather a blockade, the city's ample stores of food would have counted for little against such an enemy as this. Not only would there be disease to contend with, but the sheer terror of being surrounded by such a hellish foe day and night would drive many within to a nightmarish despair. The Duchess had been forced to accept that unless a substantial relief force were to come, a most cruel fate for Ebino was sealed. The foe proved to be not only terrifying, but numerous as well. Thanks to a westerly breeze, the stench of the zombies and ghouls amongst their ranks preceded them. Yet these proved to be the least of the threats they had to offer, for there were also monstrous horrors with blue-tinged flesh and black armoured knights illuminated from within by an evilly hued glow. A brace of vampires led them, including Duke Alessandro himself. No one in Ebino knew who his companion had been when alive. Perhaps some accursed visitor to Tilea, come to serve the Duke in undeath, or the Duke's vampiric sire, or some captain of the guard whom the Duke himself had inflicted with the curse of vampirism. The latter possibly seemed best to suit his current role within the army, as his golden armour marked him out leading the ranks of a heavily armoured unit of foot soldiers. Their blades glowed green and unnatural, engendered by the potent necromantic energies coursing through shrunken veins of long-dried blood. The vampire duke himself rode with a band of hellish knights. Their steeds were long since bereft of flesh, their eye sockets burned blue and eerie, and ragged remnants of ancient cloth barding fluttered about their legs. Each rider clutched a sturdy lance, and sported the age-russeted armour of archaic design in which they had been so carefully interred centuries before. Upon the far right of the vampire duke's line strode a band of hideous monstrosities, as big as ogres, but ganglier, with dried, drawn flesh, making their faces much more horrible to behold than that of any living brute. Their flesh was pierced with shards of bone, perhaps to stimulate their rigor mortis-ridden muscles, or just to appear more ghastly. From a tower top, near the town gate, the dwarven engineer Welleg could hear the clanking of the levers and wheels that raised the portcullis. From beneath the hood of his red woollen cloak, puffs of smoke emerged, as the cannon crew he commanded busied themselves to ready their machine, stripping off the lead apron from the touch-hole, pouring and bruising the powder, then knocking the ash from the slow match in the linstock over the parapet. Welleg peered over the walls to decide what should be his first target. The gate swung open, and out came the Duchess Maria's soldiers. One of her 2 companies of mercenary crossbowmen led the way, rushing off to the right to find a spot from which to launch their bolts. Behind them, marching steadily and purposefully to the sound of a brass kettledrum, came the famous Ironsides, each dwarf sporting a fluttering banner upon his back. Behind them came her knights, almost wholly armoured from hoof to head. The race was on. The battle. Welleg's cannon boomed, its ball smashing one of the Black Riders to pieces. The crossbowmen moved boldly off towards the right flank between the moat and the road, while the Ironsides regiment marched directly forwards down the road, thus allowing the knights and the light horse to cross the bridge before the gatehouse. Unknown to the foe, the Duchess was now outside the walls. Captain Sir Giorgio, however, was only too aware. He rode ahead of her, in command of the knights, and now began scrutinising the foe's disposition, desperately determining how best to get the Duchess safely past the foe and away. The Vampire Duke's army moved straight forwards, maintaining its neat front, a goal made easier by the fact that the Black Riders could move directly towards the house before them, knowing their ethereal nature meant they could move right through it whenever they liked. The broken bones of the rider shattered by iron shot moments before now re-knitted themselves together until the rider rode with his comrades once more, as if nothing had occurred. The dwarven engineer Welleg, peering through a pocket perspective glass, swore to himself quietly. If a direct hit from 9 pound of iron round shot had proven so ineffective, then what use was he and his gun? Still, he thought, if he could hit the Vampire Duke, surely that might prove distracting at least, and distraction was everything, considering the Duchess's attempt to escape. Suddenly, ahead of the undead army, 5 rotting, blood-smeared zombies burst out of the ground, a sight which caught Captain Sir Giorgio's eye immediately. He too swore. There were already too many enemies, and here even more were being summoned. He brought to mind a prayer to Moor, and began repeating the first line over and over as he rode. Mighty Moor, Lord of the afterlife, deliver us from the corruption of undeath. Mighty Moor. In front of the captain, the dwarves had finally cleared the junction before the bridge, creating a gap sufficient for him and his company. Spurring his horse, he led his knights through it, glancing behind to ensure that the light horsemen were following as had been the plan. They were. Just as he began to turn to face the foe once more, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye, something beyond the crossbowmen, within the shadow of the walls. At first his stomach knotted, as he thought it must be more undead. But then he saw it was living men on living horses. They possessed no banner to mark them out, and sported a veritable mishmash of arms and armour. The Arabiati. They had come, as they had promised. He saw now that one amongst the riders was looking his way, raising a staff as if to signal him, as if to say, "Good morrow." White-haired, white-bearded, and robed in faded blue, it must be Lord Totto himself. Perhaps, thought Sir Giorgio, quite surprising himself in the process, perhaps we can succeed. Lord Totto was a wizard, and apart from a blessed priest of Moor, surely there was no better ally to have when fighting the already dead. He was beginning to believe the Duchess had every chance of escaping, and that Urbino could actually be saved. Lord Totto and his riders were, of course, ignorant of the plan, but a man such as he could not be so foolish as not to realise something was afoot. Why would so weak a force issue forth from the safety of the walls if not to attempt some sort of breakout or to target a particular foe? The enemy was far too strong to beat in open battle. Whatever was happening, Lord Totto had given his word to come to the Duchess's aid, and he would surely do all that he could. His spells were prepared, and rather appropriately, considering the Arrabbiati were commonly known as the Brotherhood of Shadows, his magics were drawn from the law of shadow. Conjuring a penumbral pendulum, he threw it at the vampire on foot ahead of him, but its strength fell so short of what was needed, it immediately seemed a pathetic gesture, and with the foe's massed rank shambling ever closer, the wizard began to wonder whether he had joined in with some great folly. A flurry of crossbow bolts flew over Lord Totto's head to fell all but one of the recently raised zombies, while Weleg's second cannonball ploughed into the earth before the same vampire Totto's spell had failed to harm. It seemed the demonic creature was blessed with wickedly good fortune. The massed regiment of skeletons, looking to be preparing to charge Lord Totto's company, lurched forward suddenly, but their progress began to slow until they resumed their previous lethargic pace. As the Black Riders did indeed move through the house as if it were nothing more than mist, the vampires redoubled their efforts to conjure up necromantic magics. They were rewarded by the death of one Ironside dwarf as the curse of years took hold, and the summoning of 8 more zombies to reinforce the lone one stumbling up ahead. The horror that had once been Duke Alessandro watched with dead eyes set in pallid flesh, his snarling mouth revealing 2 wickedly sharp fangs. The dwarves, marching as best they could down the road, could sense the malignant potency of the debilitating magics wreathing them, yet their pace, slow as it necessarily was, did not lessen one jot. Captain Sir Giorgio commanded his knights to reform as quickly as they could, hoping to do so whilst moving forward, the better to screen the light horse behind him from the enemy's attention. His knights might have succeeded too, if it were not for the horrors amassed before them. They reformed well enough, but took too long over the action. The light horse funnelled through behind them and took position on the far left in plain view of the foe, while the dwarfs, although the least well equipped for the task, marched on in their own attempt to screen the Duchess's escape. Lord Totto sensed that whatever the Ibinans were up to, they were doing it on the other side of the road, so he ordered the Arrabbiati to ride up behind the crossbowmen, then to halt facing the foe while he attempted to fathom how best to assist. He could just make out Sir Giorgio shouting encouragement to his men, telling them that their moment had come, and that here and now they would prove their true worth. Once again, Weleg's artillery piece sent an iron ball within a whisker of the vampire leading the graveguard. Once again the dwarf cursed. A handful of zombies were felled by crossbow bolts, but this was not enough, and as all the undead came on, the remaining zombies charged into the dwarf's flank. The ghouls tried, but failed to join them. The shambling monstrosities on the far right of the undead line now traded places with the Black Knights, as the vampiric duke himself looked suspiciously at the nimble green-cloaked light horseman and wondered whether his cousin might be amongst them. The massed regiments on the undead left, including an ever-swelling horde of zombies, came on too, disheartening all who could see them. Wicked magics emanated from the vampires. 2 more dwarfs succumbed to another curse, while a cruelly enchanted gaze killed 5 of the Arrabbiati, sending the rest, including Lord Totto, galloping towards the town gates, perhaps if only to remove themselves from the horror of their fallen comrades' tortured, lifeless faces. The dwarves killed the last of the zombies, and now prepared themselves for the real test. Before them stood the snarling, viciously clawed crypt horrors. The Ironsides knew that they could not allow such a foe to get close to the Duchess. Van Hell's dance macabre magically moved the knights even closer, forcing Sir Giorgio's hand. If he did not charge now, he would lose his chance. He could not afford to allow the enemy knights to charge him and his men, so, with a desperate cry, and with the dwarfs also charging by their side, he urged his men on, and they thundered boldly into the much more numerous foe. The Duchess Maria watched grimly, and knew this was likely to be her one and only chance. If her knights could stand for but a few moments, if their armour could protect them against the first blows, she might just be able to make it past the foe and escape. So, Breaking off from her escort, she dug her spurs deep into a mount's flank and dashed forwards. Both units of crossbow, on the wall and on the field below, sent a flurry of bolts at the graveguard and brought down 7. Welleg's curses grew louder as yet another shot from his cannon ploughed into the dirt only a foot or so from the vampire. The dwarves crewing his gun flinched at the fury of his voice, yet busied themselves with reloading regardless, for it is in a dwarf's nature to see things through to the bitter end. On the field below, the Ironsides were certainly doing so, not only standing firm, but even felling one of the horrors. The knights, however, did not fare so well. When they came to grips with the foe, they were also gripped with fear. Sir Giorgio was no longer shouting, but screaming, his bellowing commands having twisted into a tortured and wordless sound. The foe proved too much for him and his men, and as 3 knights died, the rest broke and fled. The vampire duke commanded his black knights to stand, then turn the body about. He now knew exactly where his cousin was, and he did not intend to lose her. As the ghouls crashed into the beleaguered dwarf's flank, a gust of magical wind allowed a mass of newly summoned undead to appear on the field, reinforcing every unit that had so far been damaged, as well as creating yet another body of zombies. Umpteen Ironsides now fell, and the last few remaining finally succumbed to fear and fled pell-mell away. There was no one to help the Duchess now. Every unit on her side of the field, apart from the light horse, was broken, battered, beaten. The light horse were far too far away to help. She was all alone. The vampire duke grinned, revealing his razor-sharp fangs, evil intent writ upon his face. He began to raise his hand, ready to signal the chase, when suddenly the sound of thundering hooves caught his attention. His nephew, Lord Guglielmo, had arrived. Without hesitation, Guglielmo galloped his veteran knights right up to the undead, whilst the Duchess desperately rode on behind. The green-cloaked horsemen, for want of a better way to sacrifice themselves, now charged into the newly raised zombies. Lord Totto had rallied the last of the shadowy brothers and cast a withering spell against the foe, but it proved too weak. Welleg cheered as his neck shot flew directly at the vampire, then collapsed to his knees in frustration as he watched a skeleton push the vampire out of harm's way at the last moment. When the horrors broke into a run, Lord Totto turned and fled yet again. Foul magics curled after him, bringing down 3 of his companions and grievously wounding him. He hurtled over the bridge and through the gate, entering the town. He did not linger, however, not even to tend his wounds, but rode right through and left by the far gate. Lord Guglielmo would not flee. Instead, he braced himself as his uncle and the Black Knights charged, vowing not to yield to fear. The vampire duke laughed gleefully as he closed upon his nephew, and the two joined in personal combat. As living horses whinnied and snorted in terror, their undead counterparts simply ground their teeth. Steel rang as blade clattered against blade, and in the midst 2 Sforta lords, from both sides of the seam that divides the living and the dead, fought. The outcome was inevitable. Even Lord Guglielmo had accepted that, but all that really mattered was how long he could keep the vampire duke occupied. Somehow, although no living witness can explain how it was so, he apparently survived long enough to save the Duchess. It is said that the very moment she disappeared into the hills, the vampire's cold blade, a horribly curved butchery tool, carved Guglielmo in twain. The Duchess rode into complete obscurity for several weeks, as she presumably, desperately, crept from hiding place to hiding place.